The envelope was already open when Marcus walked through the door. Natalie stood in the center of their shared apartment, her hands completely still, her face unreadable. On the kitchen counter between them sat a printed photograph, his company Christmas party, 6 weeks ago. And in it, Marcus had his arm around his colleague Jade, his lips pressed against her temple, his eyes closed like a man completely at ease with what he was doing. Like a man who had forgotten he had a girlfriend of 4 years waiting at home. "Where did you get that?" he asked. And Natalie smiled. But to understand what that smile meant, to understand everything that was about to happen to Marcus and to Jade, we need to go back to the beginning. To the woman Natalie was before that photograph arrived in her mailbox. And to the quiet, methodical way she dismantled 2 careers, one lie at a time. Natalie Cruz was 31, a forensic accountant with a mind like a steel trap, and the patience of a woman who had learned very young that rushing anything was how you got sloppy. She had met Marcus at a mutual friend's birthday dinner 4 years earlier. Charming, tall, funny in a dry, understated way that she found genuinely attractive. He worked in business development for a mid-sized tech firm. She worked for herself, contracted by companies to find discrepancies in financial records. They were, by most measures, well matched. For 3 of those 4 years, she believed that completely. The cracks started small. Marcus began working late, not occasionally, the way he always had, but consistently, on the same evenings. Tuesdays and Thursdays. He stopped suggesting they make plans on those nights without being asked. His phone, which had always sat face up on the coffee table, migrated permanently to his pocket. He laughed differently when certain messages came through. A private, suppressed kind of laugh that he'd quickly flatten if he noticed her watching. Natalie noticed everything. It was, professionally speaking, what she did. She didn't confront him immediately. That was an amateur move, and Natalie was not an amateur. Instead, she watched. She filed information away with the same quiet precision she applied to spreadsheets. She noticed that on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Marcus mentioned Jade, a new colleague in his department, with slightly more frequency than anyone else at his office. She noticed that Jade's name came up when he was explaining something technical, when he was recounting a funny moment from work, when he was describing the new coffee machine in the break room. Jade apparently had very specific opinions about the coffee machine. Then came the Christmas party. Natalie had been invited as a +1. At the last minute, Marcus had suggested, gently, apologetically, that it might actually be a bit awkward, that his boss preferred these events to stay internal, that he'd make it up to her. She'd agreed without argument. She'd smiled and told him to have fun. What she didn't mention was that she already knew one of the junior developers at the firm, a young woman named Priya who had, 2 years earlier, been a client's intern and had stayed in touch with Natalie ever since. Priya was attending the party. And Priya, who noticed that Natalie had gone quiet on the subject of Marcus, took one look at him and Jade across the room that night and quietly took a photograph on her phone. She sent it to Natalie the next morning without comment. Natalie sat with it for 3 days. She didn't cry. Or rather, she allowed herself to cry exactly once, on the first evening, alone in the bathroom with the shower running. Then she dried her face, looked at herself in the mirror, and made a decision. She would not blow up her own life with a screaming confrontation that let him off the hook through drama. She would be precise. She would be thorough. She would be devastating. The thing about being a forensic accountant is that you develop a very particular skill set, and one of those skills is finding things that people have hidden inside places they consider safe. Natalie wasn't interested in Marcus's phone. She was interested in his company. Because here was the detail Marcus had never quite understood about his girlfriend. When she was hired to audit a business, she was given broad access to internal financial records. And 8 months earlier, she had done a routine compliance check for a firm that shared a payment processor with Marcus's employer. During that check, she had flagged an anomaly, a small recurring expense code that didn't match any vendor in the approved register. And then, because it fell outside her direct scope, she had noted it and moved on. She went back to those notes now. The anomaly was minor. $40 to $60, 12 times over 14 months, billed under a vendor code that turned out to be registered to a shell account. Sloppy, yes, but the kind of sloppy that only looks like laziness until you pull the thread. Natalie pulled the thread. She spent 4 evenings reconstructing the paper trail, and what she found was that the shell vendor was linked to a personal account belonging to someone in business development who had been quietly billing the company for client entertainment expenses that had never occurred. That someone was not Marcus. It was Jade. Natalie sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she compiled everything. Clean, sourced, annotated, with every attachment clearly labeled. And she sent it to the firm's CFO with a brief professional note explaining that while conducting adjacent compliance work, she had come across information the company's finance team might find relevant. She CC'd the firm's head of HR. She did not mention Marcus. She did not mention the photograph. She mentioned nothing personal whatsoever. It was clean, professional, and completely irrefutable. Which brings us back to the kitchen, to the open envelope, to Natalie standing perfectly still while Marcus stared at the photograph and tried to figure out which lie to reach for first. "We should talk," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We probably should." He tried the standard progression: denial, then minimization, then the eventual pivot to it was complicated. It didn't mean anything, it was just the once. Natalie let him talk. She watched him rearrange his guilt into something he could live with, watched him search her face for the devastation he expected. He didn't find it, and that unsettled him more than her anger would have. When he finally ran out of words, she told him she wanted him out of the apartment by the end of the week. She told him she had already spoken to their landlord about transferring the lease. She told him she hoped, genuinely, that he figured out who he wanted to be, because 4 years was a long time to spend with someone who had apparently been performing a version of himself. Then she told him that Jade had been placed on administrative leave that morning, pending an internal investigation into financial misconduct. The color left Marcus's face so completely that she almost felt sorry for him. "How?" he started. "I'm very good at my job," Natalie said simply. She hadn't targeted Jade out of jealousy. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had found genuine financial fraud, reported it through the correct channels, and the consequences that followed were the natural result of choices Jade had already made long before Natalie ever knew her name. Justice had simply arrived faster than it might have otherwise, with a little help from someone who knew exactly where to look. Jade was let go 3 weeks later. The firm, embarrassed, settled the matter quietly. Marcus, destabilized by the implosion of both his relationship and his closest work alliance, requested a transfer to another department and became, by all accounts, much quieter and much more careful about everything he did. Natalie moved into a smaller apartment closer to the river. She took on 2 new clients. She started running again, something she'd let slide over the past year without fully noticing. She had dinner with Priya, and they laughed until their faces hurt, and she felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't realized was pulled tight. She didn't think about Marcus much after that. Not because the wound wasn't real. It was. But because she understood, in the quiet and particular way that careful people understand things, that grief and revenge are not mutually exclusive. You can feel both, completely, and still come out the other side of them standing. Some people mistake patience for passivity. They think a woman who doesn't shout isn't paying attention. They think soft voices mean soft minds. Natalie Cruz had never been any of those things. And Marcus, ultimately, had simply been the last person to find that out.